I would like to start with a warning. Once we start the detailed account of Alfred Metraux, viewer discretion is advised, as the story is a detailed description of what he saw during a cannibalistic ceremony. Welcome to a journey into the fascinating world of the Tupinamba, an indigenous tribe from Brazil. Their story is one of resilience, culture, and a deep connection to nature. Before we start the recorded accounts of Alfred Metraux with this tribe and his detailed horrifying story about the cannibalism he witnessed, let me tell you a little bit about the Tupinamba tribe. The Tupinamba people originally inhabited the coastal regions of Brazil. Their rich history dates back to pre-Columbian times, where they thrived in their tropical paradise. They are renowned for their warrior spirit. Their bravery and skill in battle were unmatched, earning them both respect and fear from neighbouring tribes. Their culture is deeply rooted in nature. They see themselves as guardians of the forest, living in harmony with their surroundings. They hunt, fish and gather, ensuring nothing is wasted. The Tupinamba language, part of the Tupi-Guarani family, is a testament to their distinct identity. Though the language has declined over the years, efforts are being made to revive it, embodying a resurgence of their cultural pride. Their spiritual beliefs are equally intriguing. They believe in a world inhabited by spirits, with rituals and ceremonies emphasizing respect for these supernatural beings. Today, they continue their fight for land rights and recognition, standing as a symbol of resistance and survival. They are not just a tribe, but a testament to the enduring spirit of indigenous cultures. Now for the thrilling and shocking part of our story. The following is a word-for-word detailed account of Alfred Metraux, who studied the tribe and recorded his findings with the Smithsonian in 1948. This story, along with many more details of the tribe, can be found by searching Smithsonian Institution Bureau of American Ethnology, Handbook of South American Indians. His story begins now. Religion and social values of high importance clustered around war and the closely connected practice of cannibalism. Prestige and political. Religion and social values of high importance clustered around war and the closely connected practice of cannibalism. Prestige and political power were derived mainly from the ritual slaughtering of prisoners, which was so far-reaching in its influence that it even affected sexual life. The tribe's excessive interest in ritual cannibalism contributed toward keeping the different tribes and even local communities in a constant state of warfare, and was one of the chief causes of their ready subjection by Europeans. Their mutual hatred of one another, born of a desire to avenge the insult of cannibalism, was so great that the Tupinamba groups always willingly marched with the white invaders against their local rivals. Their bellicose disposition and craving for human flesh loom large in many aspects of their culture, such as education, oratory, poetry, and religion. The rites and festivities that marked the execution of a prisoner and the consumption of his body were joyful events which provided these people with the opportunity for merrymaking, aesthetic displays, and other emotional outlets. The Tupinamba went to war only with the certainty of victory, which they derived from the interpretation of dreams and from ritualistic performances such as dancing and reciting charms. When marching toward the enemy, they paid special attention to any omen and to dreams. The slightest bad omen was sufficient to stop the expedition. Once a party of warriors that had almost taken a village retreated because of a few words uttered by a parrot. Besides arrows and bows, Tupinamba weapons included a hardwood club with a shape unique in South America. It consisted of two parts, a long rounded handle and a flattened, round or oval blade with sharp edges. The only defensive weapon was a shield of tapir hide. Warriors donned their best feather ornaments and painted their bodies. Men of importance were followed by their wives, who carried hammocks and food for them. The advancing army was accompanied by musical instruments. Whenever possible, they used canoes to avoid long marches. The chief always headed the column, which was disposed in one line. Scouts reconnoitred the country. At night, the warriors camped near a river and built small huts in a row along a path. The proper time to assault the enemy village was chosen cautiously. As a rule, they stormed it at night or at dawn, when least expected. When prevented by a stockade from entering a village immediately, they built another palisade of thorny bushes around the village and started a siege. One tactic was to set fire to the enemy houses with incendiary arrows. Sometimes they slowly moved their fence close to the opposite wall so that they could fight at close range. The Tupinamba fought with courage and determination, but without much order, as they did not obey any command during the battle. They opened the attack by shooting arrows, hopping about with great agility from one spot to another to prevent the enemy from aiming or shooting at any definite individual. Amid ferocious howls, they rushed against their opponents to strike them with their clubs, trying to take prisoners, one of the main purposes of the war. Because it was difficult to seize an enemy without the assistance of several persons, it was an established rule that the prisoner belonged to the first man to touch him. When a man was disarmed, the victor touched him on the shoulder and said, "You are my prisoner." Thereafter, the man was his slave. Those who remained in possession of the battlefield would roast the corpses and bring back the heads and the sexual organs of the dead. The long set of cannibalistic rites and practices began immediately after the capture of a prisoner. On the way home, the victorious party exhibited their captives in friendly villages, where they were subjected to gross insults and vituperation. The latter retaliated by expressing their contempt for their victors and their pride at being eaten as befitted the brave. Before entering their master's village, the prisoners were dressed as Tupinamba, with foreheads shaven, feathers glued to their bodies, and a decoration of feather ornaments. They were taken to the graves of the recently deceased of the community and compelled to renew, that is, clean them. Later, they received the hammocks, ornaments, and weapons of the dead, which had to be used before they could be reappropriated by the heirs. The reason for this custom was that touching the belongings of a dead relative was fraught with danger, unless they were first defiled by a captive. When the prisoners were taken into the village, women flocked around them, snatched them from the hands of the men, and accompanied them, celebrating their capture with songs, dances, and references to the day of their execution. They forced the prisoners to dance in front of the hut where the sacred rattles were kept. After this hostile reception, the prisoners' condition changed for the better. Their victors often gave them to a son or some other relative who had the privilege of slaughtering them and acquiring new names, one of the greatest distinctions which a Tupinamba coveted. The prisoners were also traded for feathers or other ornaments. In many cases, the only outward sign of the prisoner's status was a cotton rope tied around his neck, which, according to some sources, was a symbolical necklace strung with as many beads as he had months to live until his execution. The captives were in no way hampered in their movements. They knew perfectly well that there was no place to which they could escape, for their own groups, far from welcoming them, would even have killed any member who attempted to return. On the other hand, to be killed ceremonially and then eaten was the fate for which any brave longed once he had lost his liberty. Nothing would have reminded a prisoner of his impending death if, on certain occasions, he had not been exhibited in public and again exposed to jeers and provocations. At drinking bouts, portions of his body were allotted beforehand to the carousers, each of whom in the victim's presence learned the part he was to receive at the ceremonial execution. The village council chose the date of execution and sent invitations to friendly communities. Preparations for the sacrifice started a long time in advance. Certain accessories, like the plaited rope with which the victim was fastened, required a long time to make. Great quantities of beer also had to be brewed for the occasion. The prisoner feigned indifference toward these signs of his threatening fate. In certain villages, he was tied up, but then he indulged freely in all sorts of mischief to revenge his death. The rites observed in these cases started after the arrival of the guests and lasted 3 to 5 days. On the first day, the cord was bleached and artfully knotted, the prisoner was painted black, green eggshells were pasted on his face, and red feathers were glued on his body. The executioners also decorated their own persons with feathers and paint. Old women spent the first night in the hut of the captive, singing songs depicting his fate. On the second day, they made a bonfire in the middle of the plaza, and men and women danced around the flames while the prisoner pelted them with anything he could reach. The only ceremony of the third day was a dance accompanied by trumpets. The day before the execution, the prisoner was given a chance to escape, but was immediately pursued. The person who overtook and overpowered him in a wrestling combat adopted a new name, as did the ceremonial executioner. The ritual rope was passed round the prisoner's neck, the end being held by a woman. The prisoner was then given fruits or other missiles to throw at passers-by. Festivities began that night. The prisoner was often requested to dance. Apparently, he did so without reluctance and took part in the general rejoicing as if he were merely a guest. He even regarded his position as enviable, for it was an honor to die as a great warrior during dancing and drinking. The prisoner spent the remainder of his last night in a special hut under the surveillance of women, singing a song in which he foretold the ruin of his enemies and proclaimed his pride at dying as a warrior. His only food was a nut that prevented his bleeding too much. The same night the club to be used for the sacrifice received special treatment. It was decorated, like the prisoner himself, with green eggshells glued on the wood. The handle was trimmed with tassels and feathers, and finally it was suspended from the roof of a hut, women dancing and singing around it during the entire night. The following morning, the prisoner was dragged to the plaza by some old women amid cries, songs and music. The rope was taken from his neck, passed round his waist, and held at both ends by 2 or more men. Again, he was allowed to give vent to his feelings by throwing fruits or potsherds at his enemies. He was surrounded by women who vied in their insults. Old women, painted black and red with necklaces of human teeth, darted out of their huts carrying newly painted vases to receive the victim's blood and entrails. A fire was lit, and the ceremonial club was shown to the captive. Every man present handled the club for a while, thus acquiring the power to catch a prisoner in the future. Then the executioner appeared in full array, painted and covered with a long feather cloak. He was followed by relatives who sang and beat drums. Their bodies, like that of the executioner, were smeared with white ashes. The club was handed to the executioner by a famous old warrior who performed a few ritual gestures with it. Then the executioner and his victim harangued each other. The executioner derided the prisoner for his imminent death, while the latter foretold the vengeance that his relatives would take and boasted of his past deeds. The captive showed despondency only if his executioner, instead of being an experienced warrior, was merely a young man who had never been on the battlefield. The execution itself was a cruel game. Enough liberty was allowed the prisoner to dodge the blows, and sometimes a club was put in his hands so that he could parry them without being able to strike. When at last he fell down, his skull shattered. Everybody shouted and whistled. The position of the body was interpreted as an omen for the executioner. The prisoner's wife shed a few tears over his body and then joined in the cannibalistic banquet. Old women rushed to drink the warm blood, and children were invited to dip their hands in it. Mothers would smear their nipples with blood so that even babies could have a taste of it. The body, cut into quarters, was roasted on a barbecue, and the old women, who were the most eager for human flesh, licked the grease running along the sticks. Some portions, reputed to be delicacies or sacred, such as the fingers or the grease around the liver or heart, were allotted to distinguished guests. As soon as the executioner had killed the victim, he had to run quickly to his hut, which he entered passing between the string and the stave of a stretched bough. Indoors, he continued running to and fro as if escaping from his victim's ghost. Meanwhile, his sisters and cousins went through the village proclaiming his new name. On this occasion, the male and female relatives of his generation also had to take new names. The members of the community then rushed into the killer's hut and looted all his goods, while the killer himself stood on wooden pestles, where the eye of his victim was shown to him and rubbed against his wrist. The lips of the dead man were sometimes given to him to wear as a bracelet. However, his flesh was strictly taboo to the killer. After this, the executioner had to recline in a hammock until the hair on his shaved forehead had grown again. During seclusion, he entertained himself by shooting miniature arrows at a wax figure. For 3 days, he might not walk, but was carried whenever he needed to leave the hut. He also avoided several foods, especially condiments. His return to normal life was celebrated by a big drinking bout, at which the killer tattooed himself by slashing his body in different patterns with an agouti tooth. The more tattooing marks a man could exhibit, the higher was his prestige. Even after the feast, he was subject to a few more restrictions before he was again a full-fledged member of the community. The same rites were practiced if, instead of a man, a jaguar had been killed. Later, when the Tupinamba could no longer sacrifice their war prisoners, they would open the graves of their enemies and break the skulls with the same ceremonies. The heads of dead enemies were pinned to the ends of the stockade posts. That concludes Alfred Metraux's first-hand account of a start to finish cannibal encounter. Subscribe for more incredible facts and stories.